Hey everybody, today is Monday, October 16th, 2023. Coming up on the show today, from Reservation Dogs, editor Varun Vishwanath.
That episode was an editorial beast. Sterling had to shoot it in 3 days instead of the usual 4.5 because he shared shooting time with the season 2 finale, which, you know, they were on the road, they had to come to LA, so they needed more time for that. And I remember Sterling telling me, he's like, I know it was all over the place. I know there's an episode in there, just find it.
And editor Patrick Tuck.
This job, the way to enjoy it is to enjoy learning. And I think that's a huge aspect of editing and filmmaking in general, is that if you are constantly looking for things that allow you to expand your skill set or even just your mentality of the world or your outlook, it's extremely valuable and it's extremely fun.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Okay, hello, welcome. Great to have you here. My name is Matt Fury. Really, it says that on my passport and everything. But who I am means nothing as far as what we're doing today. No, I have two other names to give you that mean much more as far as today's proceedings go. And those names are Varun Vishwanath and Patrick Tuck, editors of the FX series Reservation Dogs. In case you don't already know Varun from other circles you might travel in, you may remember he was on the podcast not that long ago to talk about another show he cut, Blind Spotting. When Varun was on for that, he took me aside and said, "Hey, podcast boy, I have another show that I do called Reservation Dogs. It's really great. Perhaps you've heard of it, and I would be very happy to come back on the podcast to talk about it." Well, I had heard of Reservation Dogs because critics have been raving about it since the first of its 3 seasons came out, but I had not seen it. Well, that was then, and this is now, as they say. I happily binged all 3 seasons and eagerly awaited the opportunity to connect with Varun and his co-editor Patrick Tuck to discuss it. And it seems that opportunity is right now. In case you are not familiar with Reservation Dogs, or Res Dogs, it is about 4 Native American teenagers growing up in Oklahoma within the close confines of their indigenous community. Those 4 kids are named Alora, Bear, Cheese, and Willie Jack. Together, they are the Reservation Dogs. And aside from all the usual coming-of-age challenges one faces in that time of their life, the 4 kids and the community as a whole are mourning the loss of Daniel, a res dog who passed away in the year prior to when the show opens. The show was created by Taika Waititi and showrunner and director Sterling Harjo, and it also has the distinction of being the first series to feature all Indigenous writers and directors, along with an almost entirely Indigenous North American cast and production team. So aside from being a really well-written, acted, and edited show, it also gives viewers a very authentic perspective from voices that have not often been heard from previously in film and television. Speaking of voices, you are about to hear Varun and Patrick's in just a moment. But first, we will do that thing where I give you some truly valuable info about our sponsor, Extreme Music. Now, Reservation Dogs, like many a fine show, has so much great music woven into the fabric of the storytelling. If you want your next TV show or movie to be fine, well, you got to get to weaving great music into your story as well. Who's going to help you with that? Well, those musical tailors and seamstresses, that's a tough word to say, seamstresses at Extreme Music. For over 2 decades, they have been the ones who film and TV makers have turned to for the very, very best in production audio. Not only do they have a ginormous catalog of tracks for you to use, they make it so easy to find the music you're looking for by giving you a powerful search engine where you can seek what you need using metadata like tempo, lyrics, composer, genre, instrumentation. And when it comes to instrumentation, they'll even let you do a little customizing on the tracks they give you. You don't like that bass track? Take it out, or leave it in. It's all up to you. And do not forget about my favorite feature, where you can give Extreme Music a reference track that you like, and they will use their artful intelligence to find you ones just like it, maybe even better. You can take care of everything, including the licensing, right there on their website. Or maybe you get a real nice person from their team on the phone and you do it together. Togetherness, that's what it's all about. So the next time you have a story to tell, get together with Extreme Music. Now then, as far as getting together, it is time for us to do that with Reservation Dogs editors Varun Vishwanath and Patrick Tuck.
Oh my God, I sound even more poopy.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it?
Don't want to miss that.
It's really embarrassing. I want to start someplace where I don't typically start with these questions, and that is your feelings about the show. I know what the critics love about the show. I know what I love about the show, but I wanted to know from each of you, what is it you love and appreciate most about the show? Whether it's the story itself or the work environment, what is it that you love about Reservation Dogs? Varun, why don't we start with you?
You know, the hook into this show for me has always been, like, I have a very romantic idea about the sense of belonging. I've lived away from home longer than I've lived at home, lived in 3 different countries now. But I have the sense of like, I want to belong somewhere and want people to belong to, a place to belong to. And going through this whole show, the arc of the characters of finding their sense of belonging to their community, to their place, that really is what I enjoy the most. And I feel like I bring that energy to it as much as possible. And I was like, no, that's another little layer of some connection back to your people, and I think that's the overarching kind of theme for me that hooks me again and again.
And Patrick, aka Tuck, what's your take?
For me, I didn't work on season 1, so I was a actual fan of the show when it first aired. And to me, it really reminded me of me and my buddies growing up, running around and just hijinks in general. And that really reeled me in. And then on top of it, to have the layers of like something I'd never seen before on television. I'd never seen this community. It's unfamiliar to me, and it's really fun to experience how narratively they were laying it out. And I had never seen anything like it before. And then to get the opportunity to work on season 2 was such a huge highlight. In fact, after season 1 had aired, I messaged Varun and just said to him, like, oh, I love your work. We had never talked before. I just cold messaged him and said, such a fan of your work. I really love the hunting episode was my favorite episode at the time. And to get the opportunity to work on season 2 was a big deal for me. And I basically just went through the show hoping that I wasn't going to ruin it.
Best message I ever got. I was like, somebody likes my work. Who is this guy? Let's talk up. And lo and behold, like a few months down the line, Patrick Vandenbush, who worked with Patrick Tuck on Dave, came on board as our post-producer and brought Patrick in to interview, and the rest is history.
Yeah.
Taking into consideration what you each said about Reservation Dogs, what do you each look for in a project at this stage of your careers? Film versus television, type of genre, type of working environment. What is it you look for most in a project right now?
I tend to look for projects that aren't going to pigeonhole me. I like to challenge myself, and I like to do things I haven't done before. I think that part of this job is the way to enjoy it is to enjoy learning. And I think that's a huge aspect of editing and filmmaking in general, is that if you are constantly looking for things that allow you to expand your skill set or even just your mentality of the world or your outlook, it's extremely valuable and it's extremely fun. So I'm always looking for projects that are slightly different than what I've done before or are tackling a different genre than I've done before. Like Reservation Dogs allows itself to be many things at once and allows itself to dip its toes in a lot of different things. So I'm always looking for shows like that.
Yeah, for me, very much in line with what Tuck said, I gravitate towards new stories that haven't been told before by people that haven't had the chance to tell these stories. And comedies with a strong dramatic spine, I guess, encapsulates it. And I think there are hour-longs that slant comedy as well. So I'm not really restricting myself to a specific like time format. I just wanted to be like a new story and not something that's based on something prior.
Varun, you've been on the show from the very beginning. Patrick joined in season 2. We should jump into my favorite question, which is, how'd you get this gig? Patrick was already a fan, so he knew what he was buying into. Varun, when you take a gig, you have no idea how it's going to pan out, despite who the players may be. But suffice to say, tell me about getting this job, how you got it, and what convinced you to take it.
Yeah, I was working on What We Do in the Shadows season 2 when the announcement for the pilot came out. This was like a couple of months before everything shut down in March of 2020. And at that point in time, I wanted to put my hand up for it. And so I was like, wow, this is great. Like, this is a coming of age story. I've done those before and I like that. And this is a new voice. And Taika's involved as well as he was in What We Do in the Shadows. So I was very excited about it. And almost at the same time, Yana Gorskaya, the editor, has been my mentor for a very long time. She was literally in the other room and she emailed me saying, we should get you on this. So it kind of all serendipitously happened within the same 5 minutes. So I walked over to Yana's room. I was like, hey, I'm going to reach out to Garrett Bash, who is the producer that we shared between both the shows. And she's like, yeah, we'll put in a good word for you. Like, you're going to be on your way. So I put my hand up for the pilot. But then, of course, the pilot didn't go in February as it was supposed to. It got pushed to later. So then I was brought on to the pilot as one of 3 editors in 2020 with the pitch to join the show if it went to series. So in the beginning, I kind of got grandfathered into the pilot. But then I did interview with Sterling before he hired me for the series. And I was really nervous. Had my pitch ready to be like, yeah, sense of belonging, all of that stuff. And then as soon as I got on the call, Sterling was like, oh, you worked on the pilot, right? Cool. That's great. Let's just try it out. And then I had my questions about like, what are you thinking about for the rest of the season? And so we just rambled on for about 20 minutes, made friends. And he's like, okay, cool, let's go. So that's how the beginnings of Reservation Dogs were for me.
I think for people listening, they should really pay attention to what Patrick did, which is if you're interested in his show or you're looking for a job, email one of the editors on it now and say, I really love your work. That's not a bad way to start. But if we could flesh that out a little more, Patrick, tell me about getting that gig, who you interviewed with, and the connection with the show Dave.
Sure. I had worked with a post-producer/producer named Patrick Vandenbush, who has become a very close friend of mine. And we worked on Dave's season 1, which anyone knows the season 1 of a television show has a lot of growing pains and it's a lot of like figuring things out. And Pat and I sort of found solace in each other for a very difficult first season, but one that paid off in a big way. We worked on season 2 together as well. And then he got the opportunity to work on Reservation Dogs season 2 because the post-producer wasn't coming back. And then he had heard through conversations with Sterling and the other showrunner that one of the editors wasn't coming back for season 2. So I think she had a scheduling conflict, Gina Sansom, who is also an incredible editor. So he threw my name in the hat, which I am going to be eternally grateful for because it allowed me one of the greatest experiences of my life. And I thank him all the time. So he put my name in the hat. Sterling said, yeah, let's go ahead and interview this guy. We hopped on a Zoom call and it was really funny. Sterling sort of prefaced the call with, just so you know, I hate Zoom interviews and I especially hate interviews with editors because I have no idea if this is going to work, and it makes a lot of sense, like how can you know if someone can edit based on what they're talking about? So he prefaced that and then said, what do you think of the show? And obviously, as I had messaged Varun previously, I was already a fan of the show. I told him that I had messaged Varun and how much I just love the atmosphere and the way the show is able to toe the line of different tones. And he was into that. And then we talked more a little bit about the show and our favorite episodes and favorite characters and whatnot. And then he goes, well, I really don't want to do one of these again. So fuck it, you're on, let's do it. You seem like a nice guy. And I was just like, oh, great. Which I think right off the bat, it sounds like sort of a lackadaisical approach by Sterling, but I think it speaks more to his sort of ability to trust people. And he has a great gut that's able to really understand what's needed in any given situation and guide that in the right way. And so luckily it worked out. I did well, I think.
Well, don't discount exhaustion as a means of getting a job. There's nothing wrong with them just being wiped out from talking to people. Take the gig. This show could really just be a straightforward coming of age dramedy. It's like it's 4 kids growing up trying to figure out their way in the world. But the show ended up being a lot more than that for a number of reasons. I do want to go back to the pilot, Varun, and what you talked about with Sterling or Taika or whomever was in the mix for the pilot in terms of making this show a lot more than just a simple log line of 4 kids growing up in rural America.
There honestly wasn't that much conversation that I was privy to about that. I think Sterling and Taika had a lot of those conversations with FX, and what's in the pilot is very close to the script. With a lot of cut downs, there was a lot of improv we cut down, and we didn't know what to expect either as editors, what's going to happen for the rest of the season. Like my expectation was like, okay, this is going to be about these 4 kids, right? And that's going to be the central theme. And it stayed that way for a couple of episodes until we got to that cheese and big episode in the Dear Lady. And then we're like, oh, wow, there's more to this than just an ensemble, 4 kids growing, 4 high schoolers doing high school things. And very clearly the show strayed away from the classic coming of age tropes of like who's hooking up with whom, and very decidedly expanded the world. Every episode, you're like, okay, here's a new character and they're going to be around. And here's another new character. Here's a new space. And that's going to be around. We're just going to accumulate more and more around us and build it out and not just make it be like, what did the gang do today? And there are plenty of shows that do that format really well. And I think with this show, it was always about character development, about how people handle grief, how people interface with their community. And I think a lot of that happened organically. I wish I could take credit for some of it, but really, like, I feel like in season 1, all we did was like fine-tune jokes, find improv things that balanced the generations out, and try and create as much back and forth between intergenerational conversations as possible. And honestly, there wasn't any template, and we just figured it out. It's just the audacity of putting that on screen all completely rests with Sterling, and we're really happy it worked out.
It certainly did. One of the reasons the show really works out is there's so much about it that is just wonderfully authentic.
Mhm.
It is the first series to feature all Indigenous writers and directors,
Yep.
along with an almost entirely Indigenous North American cast and production team, and was filmed entirely in Oklahoma, which I think is interesting because that doesn't often happen. And it reminded me of another show that I covered, Righteous Gemstones.
Yeah.
They shoot in South Carolina. So going back to that authentic part of it, I'm pretty sure you don't, but I'm going to ask anyway. Did you cut in Oklahoma? And if you had your preference, would you? Is there some value you could get out of being there in that environment to leverage that authenticity?
We didn't cut in Oklahoma, although I did try to see if the production could have us on set for a little bit. And in talking to Sterling, we were like, oh, it would be fun to like cut while we're shooting on a couple of episodes in season 3. But just with how schedules go and we're overlapping with other shows and on the tail end of one when we start another one, that idea never really took off. But I mean, all 3 seasons were shot in Oklahoma. And I think Sterling really wanted to do that to get the local feel and crew and not have to feel like he's rebuilding something that already is so unique in what exists in the community that he grew up in, and that the community that nurtured him and all the other artists who've had their piece in this show. Actors, directors, writers, musicians, local casting for all the guest stars and extras and everything. I think almost everybody in Sterling's extended family has been an extra in one of the big group scenes. And it really shows like just the interaction between people in the background is just very natural because that's who he cast, And I would have really liked to be there. I feel like we're the only ones in post who were away from the community of production. And that's something that I wish we had a chance to access so that we could pour that experience of feeling part of that community back into the show. Hopefully we didn't do the show any disservice, but maybe we would have felt even better being with production, at least for a little bit. What do you think, Tuck?
Yeah, I think there's always value in post being a part of the production process and being familiar with everyone involved. But obviously there's budgets involved and there's things that we have to take into account that we don't necessarily have to take into account that someone else does and we have to abide to. But I think the show also functioned really well with us being remote. I think we all made a great effort to make sure that the connection was felt between everyone and that we had long conversations about what the show is, what are our characters doing. And I also felt like we were included in a lot of the production meetings and whatnot to help establish tone and discuss how things were executed and why.
Varun, you mentioned figuring things out as you went along. I mean, the show starts with the kids stealing a vehicle as a means to eventually break away from their community, and then basically wraps up with them trying to steal a vehicle as a means to help heal and repair the rifts in their community. It almost feels like, wow, you guys had to know where things were going. So I guess my question to you is, when did you know the full arc of the narrative, whether the scripts were available or not? And how does knowing or not knowing affect your ability to tell this story as best you can?
The season 3 scripts really came down to the wire because we were up against the WGA strike deadline. So I feel like we found out in real time as those scripts came in. I think the 308, 309, 310 scripts literally came like 2-3 days before the strike. And that's when we were like, oh, that's where that's going. Like, that's where 308 with the heist, harkening back to the pilot structure, is going. And this is how Sterling is choosing to bring all of this stuff together. And I really wish that we had more time to kind of let that sink in when we did find out. We were just running and gunning at that point in time. We just had to get stuff done. And then when I read the 308 script, I was like, man, I wish I was cutting this episode. So I've been jealous of you about that, Tuck, because you got to cut that heist.
Yeah, it's probably my favorite episode I worked on the show, and in that the editing experience was so fun, and it's such a rhythmic episode that it makes it really exciting. But to answer your question about how important is it to know where it's going, I think it's vital in that you need to know what reactions you're showing at what point and what ulterior motives of a scene need to happen in order to continue the story along outside of the story that's happening within the episode, right? You need to know how you're driving the big picture along. And we did find out exactly where it was ending up late, but it's also like we know these characters really well at this point, and I feel like the scripts that we had already received, they were already sprinkling in those details for us to understand what's going on, which is a sign of great writing on a show, is that it's a very intentional show with a very unique voice. And I think that's what makes it so special.
How it ended up, I think, where it had the most impact, at least plot-wise, was in the 70s episode that we did in the middle of season 3, where we really were introducing an entirely new main character. And for that, it was very vital to know that, okay, we're going to have this heist where we have the Elder Maximus, and we're setting him up and his motivations and the motivations of his peer group up in an earlier episode. So I'm glad that we had just that little bit of context to cut that episode. But otherwise, like, I feel like it kind of magically falls into this everything's connected theme, you know? Mm-hmm. And it's something that he just poo-poo and me like, that's just, something writers do. But Sterling really paid off on that. Like, it really came back all together in so many layered ways. And this might actually be a better question for him. It's like, how, did you orchestrate this whole thing, or did it just come out this way from your brain,
One of the bigger challenges in doing a show or a film is finding and maintaining the right tone of the show. I think the T word came up a little earlier. In the first episode, you introduced a character known as the Spirit, William Knifeman, who only the character Bear can see. Then throughout the series, you get into Bigfoot and aliens and this succubus-like character called the Deer Lady. So it really gets very fantastical at times. How hard is it to find and maintain that tone and to find a tone when you could really go anywhere?
I think that going anywhere is the point. For me, where I found the root of the show is in how people converse with each other and the rhythm of conversation. And just the relationships aren't overly paternalistic or prescriptive. There's always an open dialogue in conversations. And the rhythm of conversations between people is the root. But then with the introductions of new characters, we kind of take tonal adventures when we have a new character introduced. And that's a great structure that the writers came up with, which I'm sure has been used in other ways, but I think in other places, but I think it really came together in this show where, this is Big's episode and Big tells you about Deer Lady. So then you get to take this punk rock excursion into a flashback where she's out there getting justice for people that have been wronged. And so then you introduce that tone. And then when you go out hunting, there's the spookiness of what the unknown woods have. And so there you use that opportunity to introduce a different tone of kind of meditative grief and how you deal with that. And so in putting people in different situations and introducing new characters, that becomes a foil for a new tonal adventure. And I think by the end of season 1, Sterling gained the permission to be like, I can take the show anywhere.
Yeah. And for me, I think something I learned early on was that the show it talks about community and it talks about tradition in a very respectful way, but also has an irreverence that undercuts it at times, but it's never in a way that is disrespectful. It's always in a way that's more of a joke between everybody, and I think, an example of that is season 2, episode 2, The Curse, where Uncle Brownie and Bucky are taking Cheese and Willie Jack to the river to dispel of a curse, right? And they say, we have to sing an old song. There has to be an old song. And then they start singing Tom Petty. But it also worked, they do dispel the curse in that moment, and a different problem arises later in the season. But I think it's that sort of balance of irreverence with respect that is sort of the tonal, that was sort of what guided me in any joke or a serious scene was how do we find both of those things? Because I know Sterling loves to have that sort of balancing act going on.
There are themes about community and connection between generations. What I thought we would do is pick a couple episodes to explore some of those themes. You already talked about having standalone episodes to develop characters. These kids go on this journey of finding out who they really are and what their place is in the community, what their place is in the world. The character Willie Jack, she goes to visit her aunt who is in prison, looking for some kind of information, looking for answers. And that episode kicks off a journey for her where she comes back around to being sort of a healer and a medicine woman within the community. So Varun, I thought that would be a fun one for you to talk about that episode and what you did to make it work so well.
That episode was an editorial beast. Sterling had to shoot it in 3 days instead of the usual 4.5 because he shared shooting time with the season 2 finale, which, they were on the road. They had to come to LA, so they needed more time for that. So he just took a whole day, just put cameras on Paulina and Lily Gladstone and said, okay, you're just going to say a bunch of stuff. And I remember Sterling telling me, he's like, I know it was all over the place. I know there's an episode in there. Just find it. That's kind of how I came into that episode. And he had ideas about okay, why don't we use a same piece of music that we bring back over and over again to kind of underscore the patterns of this episode. That's how I started that episode. And there was a lot of stuff that we actually, there were other characters that we cut out in the prison while she was waiting. So we're really trying to put Willie Jack in this place where she feels lost and she's just in a place where she's just open to get anything from anywhere. So even the conversation she has with the old man cowboy in the waiting area, she was just open to be just give me wisdom from somewhere. I'm struggling, my friends are struggling. So much of it is Paulina's performance as Willie Jack. And if we really look back all the way to the beginning and to the end, she really is the glue here, of her generation and then eventually to the community. She is constantly reacting to everybody else. She's constantly offering something in every conversation, whether or not she has a scripted line, whether or not she has a scripted purpose in that. That's really what came together in that episode for me. And she's out here. We don't even know why her aunt is in prison. We still don't know. And we asked Sterling and he's like, yeah, we're not going to tell anybody. It just happens. Sometimes you have family in prison and you go and visit them and doesn't matter why they're there. It just matters that they're far away. And so in her going in there to reach out and lay out what would seem to be kind of minute issues that are about her immediate life, but she comes away with life lessons way beyond that. He comes away with purpose, right? And how Sterling tells it, that kind of embodies Indigenous teaching. You go in with one agenda, but you come out after a conversation, you could come out with so much more by design because nobody's telling you how to solve this problem. They are telling you how to live life. And then you glean your life lessons from there and decide how you want to apply it to this particular situation. And since you haven't been given a prescription, you kind of make it your own. And that's kind of what every generation has done. It's they make it their own. They're true to something in the core. And then she made it her own. She didn't really tell the prayer the same way when she was giving the letter to her friends. She didn't really cook the meal very well, but it was the spirit of it. What was the intention of bringing people together? And that does bring her the outcome that she wants. She brought her crew back together. And that prison visitation scene, the first cut of that was 26 minutes long. And I was like, how is this going to survive? It's 26 minutes long. We really have to cut it down. And this is a common kind of trend in our life lesson scenes or wisdom scenes. They are generally overwritten on the page. And I think Sterling does that strategically to kind of give the actors a place to go. But then in the editing, we cut it down to a third. Kind of leave it slightly open-ended, slightly vague and mysterious so that people can get their own perspective from what's being said instead of it being kind of spoon-fed. And my own experience with it was I have my own fraught relationship with the spirituality and the religiosity that I grew up with. And then while cutting this episode, I was like, man, if I was taught spirituality and religiosity this way, I think I might have been a very different person, And so in many ways, I feel it's the most corny thing to say. I feel like I had my own spiritual healing working on the show. And as corny as it sounds, it really is true.
Well, you very casually said, oh, this was a bear. Just throw a bunch of cameras on him and get him to say a bunch of things. It reminded me earlier, you mentioned the improv. And I would think, they're all terrific actors, but they're young actors. And I would assume that there wouldn't be a lot of improv. And it sounds like that is not the case. So how does that affect you as editors when you have a lot of stuff, a lot of improv to work with? And how do you manage that?
It's only helpful for an editor, because yes, it can be challenging and it can be oh, how do we get every joke that we like in here? But that's kind of the thing with the show is that it's always an embarrassment of riches. Watching the dailies, you can tell that the set is very comfortable and everyone is very familiar with each other. And there's just this energy of shoot your shot, and if something's not funny, we won't cut it in, or so everyone is sort of taking cracks here and there at certain jokes. And it's not every scene, but I would say there's certain scenes, especially the ensemble scenes, where everyone is trying to get a joke in. And that ends up being amazing to edit because you're just trying to get your favorite bits in, and it turns into like, oh, this is a game where I want to get all my favorite pieces in, and then, oh, Sterling has favorite pieces too. Let's make sure we get those in, and you're trying to balance it out, and then you watch it down, and of course it's too long, and then you're like, wow, this joke's actually not that funny next to this joke, and then you're just constantly redoing the puzzle that is the scene, and I think it's common for editors, I think, to have the mentality of like, oh man, improv is so difficult. But I think if you come at it with the attitude of just take what's funny and leave what's not, it's really not that hard, because when you're watching the dailies, you're the first audience for the scene, and so you're able to just go, oh yeah, that made me laugh, and instinctually you just pull it, And so for me, my workflow is I make these big, long select strings of everything, and I sort of group jokes up where I think they would belong in the scene in these like pods as it goes down the timeline. And then so as I'm piecing the scene together, I can just kind of play through my selects for the first section of the scene and then keep moving through it. And that stuff moves around all the time, but I find that method to be the most helpful.
We talked about finding yourself in the community like Willie Jack did. There's also the connection between generations. There is this trauma that takes place between these different generations, and how they help one another is something that very quietly but impactfully happens throughout this series. One episode that I think was a real great example of that is Frankfurter Sandwich, which sounds pretty good because I haven't had lunch. But it's a scene of the uncles in the community breaking down, coming to grips with something that happened in their past. And it's an emotional scene. It's a funny scene. And again, it's very familiar and very relatable. And I want to hear, if you don't mind, Patrick, how that all came together and what you went through to make that episode work as beautifully as it did.
Well, first, I want to mention that I cut that episode with David Chang, who is normally my assistant editor. But this season, we had a lot more opportunity to work together as co-editors on episodes. And we had a great time with that episode in that it has a lot of elements of the show that I like, which is it's very slow moving. It's very character focused, like internally on Cheese mostly. And I think that's why that scene at the end, sitting around talking to all of the uncles and them breaking down, it has so much impact because you spend the whole episode sitting with Cheese and his emotions and understanding them. And the uncle, and you're doing what the uncles are doing. You're trying to get in and you're trying to understand what he's going through because he's been vague about it. And then he opens up very casually at the start of the scene and forces everyone to sort of do the same, except that they can't be casual about it because they're not in touch with the feelings that they've been feeling. And so it just pours out. Mark Schwartzbart, our DP, did an incredible job filming that scene where the camera is sort of revolving around this circle, right? And it's going, the way they filmed it, they had it on a dolly track and it's kind of revolving back and forth, which is a difficult thing to edit, surprisingly, because you want to feel that momentum constantly through it. Instead, you don't want to feel like you're suddenly like jerked back the other direction, So it was tough to find like the right reactions and the right takes to create that sense of movement. But as you mentioned earlier, the show has a way of just sort of figuring itself out, and it very eloquently sort of plotted in itself. But it was really important for us in the edit to emphasize the impact that Cheese's words are having on the elders in that scene. And to do that, it really required to be in specific POVs at specific times, right? So when Brownie is brushing off the question sort of and says that he's a sex addict or something, and everyone laughs, but the POV is wide, right? We're sort of feeling everyone feeling that laugh, but also knowing like, he's dodging the question. And then we get to Bucky, who sort of does the same thing. And then we get to Officer Big, who can't dodge it anymore. He's in it. And so then we're in this long take of him sort of revealing all of these things that he's been feeling. And the only time we cut to a reaction is Cheese, who is taking that in and has a look of understanding, and it's that dynamic that we tried to keep throughout the scene, including when Bucky reveals that Cheese reminds him of Maximus, and so it was important to be close on Bucky for that and close on Cheese sort of taking that in in order to feel all of those things. And so that's kind of where our editing techniques came into play to make that scene work, I think.
There's an episode that, Varun, I think you mentioned offhandedly earlier, House Made of Bongs, which, I mean, the name itself is just...
I mean, yeah, that's...
Come on, where do you go from there?
Yeah.
But it does play into the connection between generations, and that's where you go back and you visit with the oldest generation. And it's in a style that's reminiscent, as the name would imply, of the film Dazed and Confused. At least it was to me. It made me wonder if you actually had that as a touchstone or a point of reference that you talked about with Sterling or anybody. I don't have the director's name of that episode on hand, but just putting that episode together and what you were drawing from to create that episode, because it did have that great 70s Dazed and Confused vibe and really helped close the loop on a lot of things that were happening throughout the series.
You know, I feel like everybody internally always referred to it as the Dazed and Confused episode. You know, the influence was loud and proud and early. And Black Horse Lowe was the director on it. And he's our go-to director for all these stoner things, right? And he's just wonderful at it. And he has a lightness around his direction where he lets people go, especially in these kind of drug trippy episodes. House Made of Bongs felt like cutting another pilot. And that was the most interesting kind of dynamic in that episode, where we had to kind of steer what Maximus was doing to get our final result. And he gave us a lot of range, that actor. He gave us a lot of range. But then we had to find that, how does this connect back to the pattern of the Reservation Dogs dynamic of teenagers and their high school lives, patterning that in a common way, but also filling in the gaps of like, oh, this is where Grandma Mabel started. This is where Grandma Irene started. This is where Brownie started. And the casting and the performance was just so fantastic. So I spent that whole time being like, okay, this is the best moment where we just hook into Brownie and be like, that's Brownie. We know who that is. That's Bucky. We know who that is. And that was the adventure in that episode. And then, of course, towards the end, it became a Close Encounters inspiration with the alien. And we, to earn that, we had to have drug tripped enough before. Was that real? Was that not? And we try to stay in Maximus' perspective, like not give a verdict whether it was or was not real. It was very real to him, and the rejection he faced from his friends was very real. And that's kind of, you set up the starting point of like, this is where things fray between him and his friends. And that is a pattern of that generation. But this current generation, when people start wandering away from the group, we pull them back, which is what we do in Frankfurter Sandwich, which is like Cheese is starting to stray away from the group, and the group pulls him back. And so that generational trauma of like, we've abandoned people when they needed, when we've now learned that we abandoned them when they needed us, we're not going to let another one go, is kind of what that pattern starts over there. And I really loved leaving all those little crumbs in there for the later episodes to pick up. That was the coolest thing for me in working on House Made of Bongs. Like, drop all the crumbs. Just, pick up crumbs that other episodes left and then drop new ones for episodes to pick up. And you don't really know where it's going. Like, it's so unpredictable. Nobody can ever tell, like, oh, what is going to happen to Maximus? Why are you showing me Maximus? But I'm in it for the ride, That was my experience working on House Made of Bongs.
Well, I think it goes without saying, if you have a house made of bongs, there's going to be a lot of crumbs around. So it just makes sense. I want to go back a season. I don't know if Mr. Lowe directed this episode 8 in season 2. This is where the plot thickens.
He did.
He did? Well, okay. Well, there you go. That you said he has a gift, aside from just stoner storytelling, lightness. And this is a really tricky episode to me because, again, you have sort of the drug trippy stuff, which is funny and weird, but then some also serious weird stuff going on in reality.
Yeah, and that's episode 8, which for me, every season of television I worked on is always like the most difficult part of the season, because it's either you have like not enough episodes locked at that point, or you're like still trying to finish the rough cut of this episode 8, or, and that one especially was like, oh, well, this is going to take so much experimentation to figure out like what's the right amount of trippiness and when do we get tired of that trippiness. And so, yeah, we downloaded a lot of filters, and we threw a lot of filters on a lot of clips and messed around. David and I, David also helped me edit this episode, and we were just like tweaking things to make them weird and make them bendy and make them surreal and whatnot. And of course, the first cut went too far with it, but was also like a great basis, I think, for for where it ended up, in that like a lot of the trippy stuff we experimented with actually ended up being in there. And on top of that, they also shot a few of the scenes with certain lenses that were like, some were kaleidoscope lenses where it like, you know, they shot into like the sun coming through the trees and it made it super trippy effects. And so we did a lot of overlaying and crossfades between stuff for that. And they also shot with a lens that like you could rotate it and it would make it wave naturally, which we found we loved and we wanted to augment in other areas of the episode. So we found a filter that sort of did something similar. But I would say tonally, it was a challenge because we were, at some point, you do get tired of seeing someone tripping on acid, you know, and it's not just acid. Obviously, he's on all sorts. He's on a crazy concoction that Kenny Boy created. And Black Horse and I were really trying to find that balance. And I think the key to it was figuring out, how does it internally tell us what's going on with Big? And we really focused in on that because there were other scenes actually where Officer Big saw Teeny in present day and she's like holding an alligator, and there's this whole like extra meaning behind the seminal woman that he's envisioning is Teeny, and there was a lot of layers there, and we ended up pulling back on those things because it didn't tell us so much about what Big was going through as much as it was sort of relieving Big of guilt, which we didn't want to feel until the end of the episode anyway, you know? So yeah, it was a massive balancing act of figuring out where internally we could read what Big was going through, and then to have it all come out and he's watching this catfish cult, if you will. To
put it lightly.
Yes. And that is just so fun and such a great payoff after going down a crazy trip with him, you know?
It wasn't that long ago that I was speaking with Varun about another show, Blind Spotting, and needle drops played a big part in that show. Same thing here. The needle drops in this series are so eclectic, but also so important to the narrative at times. I mean, you open the show with the Stooges, I Want to Be Your Dog playing, which is perfect, as we're meeting the reservation dogs for the first time, watching them steal a truck. But then there are episodes where you literally have entire episodes built around a song, like Tom Petty's Free Fallin' or Redbone's Come and Get Your Love. So with those, I kind of get it. Like that's got to be baked in there in the script. But for the others, how are some of those more memorable needle drop choices made?
Tiffany Anders, our music supervisor, surfaces so many amazing musicians and tracks and, you know, across genres. I mean, we do lean punk rock, country rock, and also even the kind of moody, ethereal stuff. Sterling does a fantastic job of discovering and bringing in musicians who have otherwise not had a big presence in TV to say, okay, you, this native musician, you now have a voice. And like whole episodes tonally get defined by that. Like one of them was 203, the roofing episode with Bear. And initially when I temped that, it was a lot of Mato, our composer's music from season 1, being like, okay, here, this is how we're going to do it. And then Sterling came in in his cut. He's like, man, like, I think we need something different. And he reached out to Samantha Crane, who is an indigenous artist from Oklahoma, and said, hey, do you have something? And Samantha sent us a bunch of demos that she was working on. And we loved it so much. And that became kind of the bed of kind of spiritual, ethereal undertone that then led to Bear having this intense but cathartic conversation with Daniel's dad and them seeing this orb. And again, to reuse Earned, I don't think we would have earned that ending or the weight of that episode without that music. And the same thing happened in Dear Lady as well, in 303. Tuck can tell you more about that. But like the music of this, music for the show, like there have been stuff that I've temped in, but then Sterling always comes in and beats it. Tiffany always comes and beats it, always. And that's been my experience on the show. And there was a point of time where they were like, oh, you know, this should be a 90s. Like we got a note from higher up saying, oh, this has to be a 90s nostalgia track. Like, can we find something that's 90s nostalgia? But then that's where Sterling will put his foot down. It's like, no, this is 90s country nostalgia. It might not be mainstream nostalgia that everybody else is used to, but I'm going to put my flag in the ground here for country rock of my time that I grew up with. And I'm going to give it a presence.
You know, Tuck, you mentioned David, your assistant, getting additional editor duties. Varun, I think you did as well. Marcella, I think she worked with you on 305.
That's right. Yeah.
So how do you know when to give your assistants editorial duties or additional editor credits? For you, what is the threshold they have to cross, or what are the reasons for why you need to give them that shot?
Well, a big part of it, to be frank, is you're trying to balance out the amount of work that you have, and you want to get it all done in a timely manner. And part of that is having a helping hand, right? And David and I had worked long enough together that I knew that our tastes were aligned, you know, and I had been throwing him scenes for a long time. And part of a big like green flag for me is if someone makes a point of trying to make it better without me mentioning something about it. Because the way I like to do it is I'll delegate a scene and then he'll pass it back and say, yeah, what do you think of this? And I'll give notes and whatnot. And then he would go back and do another pass with those notes in mind, but also looking how to make it better in general. And then it's those conversations that we have about like, oh, I like how you did that. I'm curious, like what inspired that? How did you get to that point? That make it really clear that the passion is there, you know? And so for me, that was really obvious with David and continues to be. And now he's his own editor and is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, we are an apprenticeship-based profession, right? And so I benefited from having, incredible mentorship from Yana Gorskaya and Dane McMaster, amazing editors who've brought me along on their adventure for a good 5 years before then setting me up on my own. I do credit being able to work on this show to them. I'm trying to do my best to like pass that on. And Marcella, this is the third season of TV that I'm working on with her. And she's very hungry to cut scenes, and she would always take at least a couple of scenes every episode, and we would try to do passes of notes on it. And for Housemaid of Bongs 305, she put her hand up very enthusiastically saying, okay, you have a 2-week break coming up. I want to cut this episode, because I was initially going to ask Tuck, be like, hey, could you like get this started and I'll come and finish it. But Marcella was like, I want to do it. So she took a full pass at that episode, which was an amazing feat to take on, especially that one, which was tonally different. It was we weren't hooking straight back to like our series regulars. And she did a really fantastic job of that. And then I spent like 3 days working on it before it went out. So that's kind of how I approach. I want to pay it forward and give them the confidence. And in terms of credits, the degrees of credits, like I try to hold myself to this standard where if the assistant editor in stepping up to editing duties is able to do at least 1 or 2 rounds of notes, either from the director, from the producer, from the network, at that stage, I would fight for a co-editing credit. If it was that the assistant editor helped out, in the editor's cut stage, did first cuts, did a couple of rounds of notes, but wasn't able to participate in later rounds of notes, that's when I would like fight for at least an additional editor credit.
So the show's called Reservation Dogs. There's a Reservoir Dogs poster in one character's room. And then at one point you have a reference to Hattori Hanzo, the samurai sword maker from Kill Bill. So what is with the Quentin Tarantino connection here?
It is exactly what it is. Like it is paying homage to Quentin Tarantino's style of filmmaking and his respect for pop culture and how that plays back into references, his unique choice of music. And as Sterling puts it, like it's a very catchy title. Him and Taika came up with the idea of calling it Reservation Dogs to of course, like trade on Reservoir Dogs, but also like that is the way that people in these small communities in rural America interface with pop culture is so much through film and television. And so it is kind of a nod to his own experience growing up where he did. I mean, a lot of people say, "Oh, you worked on Reservoir Dogs." Like, I wish I worked on Reservoir Dogs, but I worked on Reservation Dogs. But I'll take it. Yeah,
it's all the time.
Well, listen, I don't know if that's the perfect last question to end on, but at least I didn't ask you which character you relate to most. So be thankful for that.
No Facebook quizzes, thank you.
You got that right, Varun. No silly questions or Facebook quizzes to close out this episode. Just a big thank you to Patrick and Varun for coming on the podcast to talk about this beautifully crafted TV show. If you haven't seen it yet, pay your respects to Tuck and Varun, not to mention doing yourself a favor, by checking out the show on Hulu, or whatever streaming platform in your neck of the woods that happens to have it. Something that is easily available in every corner of the world is Avid Media Composer, which is a good thing. Because great stories are just waiting to be told by voices from all over this little planet of ours. You could be one of those voices. I hope you are. I might actually have a shot at getting you on the podcast. But first, you got to put in the work to tell your story. And the absolute editorial workhorse of the film and TV industry is Avid Media Composer. You should try it for yourself if you haven't already. How can I do that, you ask? Well, you just click that link in the show notes and it will take you right to avid.com where you can figure out the rest yourself. I can't do everything for you. And that will do it for today. Thank you for dropping by and learning about reservation dogs with me. What will we be talking about next and when? I honestly don't know. But please make sure you are subscribed to the podcast. That way you don't have to wonder. A new episode will just show up on your digital doorstep. Until it does, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.